From 1478 to 1834, the Catholic Church in Spain established offices throughout the country with support from the monarchy to pursue one goal: the removal of all non-Catholics. It was a brutal period marked by persecution, torture, fear, and death, known as the Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
In today's episode, we're going to go over the history of the Spanish Inquisition, with all of its brutality and torture and death. Hooray! That's absolutely my jam. Now first, as we normally do on the AFOUT podcast, we're going to start with the historical context. How and why did it begin in the late 15th century? That's the 1400s. Was there any precedent in Spain or in Europe more broadly? That explains why Spain would start hunting down non-Catholics. Why those years in particular? Context, you see, helps us get a better understanding of the history that leads up to and surrounds the Spanish Inquisition, which is a super important part of engaging in history, and one of the things I like to do on this podcast. Then, we'll take a look at some of the key events, people, places, and torture devices of the Spanish Inquisition, before capping off how it officially ended in 1834. And although the Spanish Inquisition did bleed outside of the homeland of the Spanish colonies, today I'm just going to focus on the Inquisition within Spain itself. There's no cannibalism today, fortunately or unfortunately, but there was a whole lot of medieval-style torture, so it's going to be a good time. So let's get started. So the basis for the Spanish Inquisition rests in tensions between the Catholic Church and those with other beliefs. And no, this time it's not the Protestant Reformation. It goes back way before the Protestant Reformation was even a thing. While I could probably trace this back to the Romans, I'm going to start today's historical context with a papal bull. In 1184, Pope Lucius III issued a papal bull, which is essentially just an official document or decree from the Pope. It called for ad abellendum. Ad abellendum. That's the one, which is abolishing or removing heretics from the church. And with this began the Age of Inquisitions, because although the Spanish Inquisition was probably the most well-known and infamous of them, it wasn't the only Inquisition. Or even the first. The accompanying heretic hunting that took place after Lucius's papal bull is known as the Episcopal Inquisition, named after the local bishops, or episcopals, who were sent to their dioceses twice a year to hunt for any heretics. And there were a handful of groups targeted in this initial Episcopal Inquisition. One of them were the Cathars in southern France, also known as the Albigensians. They believed in dualism, which in their context meant that there was a good God and an evil God. The good one ruled in heaven, while the evil one ruled over their world and the present age that everybody was living in. So it went against the Catholic Church's teachings. It's not two gods, they believe in just the one God, right? And, as a result, the Catholics wanted to root them out and destroy them. To do this, they sent inquisitors, men from the church who investigated claims of heresy, conducted trials, and then went to enact the punishments. Between 1208 and 1218, so over the span of a decade, over 15,000 Cathars were persecuted and killed, and by 1350, the entire sect was destroyed. So I guess the Catholics were successful with that one. But the problem with the Episcopal Inquisition is that it was incredibly disorganized. Villagers felt free to just run around all willy-nilly and burn people they deemed to be heretics without holding a proper trial. And that won't do, because that's just normal murder, right? Not murder authorized by the church, which I guess makes it okay. So, to combat this, Pope Gregory IX instituted a new law. Heretics who are prosecuted and condemned will be met with punishment, and those who are repentant will get life in prison, while those who are unrepentant will be burned alive. And this began the Papal Inquisition. I also want to point out that Pope Gregory is also on the record for saying, quote, "When you hear any layman speak ill of the Christian faith, defend it not with words, but by the sword, which you should thrust into their belly as far as it will go." End quote. It's a little harsh, isn't it? I don't know. Feels a little harsh to me. Now, religion, if you couldn't tell already, religion in the medieval and early modern periods was just different. Violent. They were so pious and zealous in their beliefs that they would kill to defend them from whoever they deemed a threat, which seems pretty counterintuitive to the fifth commandment of thou shalt not kill. But anyways, the Papal Inquisition broadened the scope beyond the Cathars and a handful of other groups. Now, any heretics were questioned. People with slightly different or clashing religious beliefs were sent to Inquisition centers, interrogated, and then dealt with accordingly. And we know all this because the Catholic Church kept volumes of documentation. Seriously, they were as fanatical about record keeping of heretics and what they did with them as they were about heresy in general. So, I guess that helps us historians know what really happened. When an entire area was under review, a pair of inquisitors would be sent together to interrogate and try suspected heretics with a tribunal, and things carried on in this way until 1252. In 1252, things went a step further when Pope Innocent IV sanctioned torture as a means of extracting information and truth, in very heavy air quotes there, from prisoners accused of heresy. Pope Innocent is quoted as saying, quote, "Anyone who attempts to construe a personal view of God, which conflicts with church dogma, must be burned without pity." End quote. Again, that's a bit harsh, no? That feels a little harsh to me. Sitting up here in 2024. Now, if suspected heretics wouldn't confess on their own, then inquisitors were now authorized to torture them until they did, and then burn them at the end, all thanks to Pope Innocent IV, and the irony of his name is not lost on me. And anyway, we all know how torture is going to go down, right? I mean, think of how many people must have falsely confessed to crimes they didn't commit and aren't even real crimes outside of what the Catholics decided that were, just to stop the pain of torture. It's crazy, right? Like, just for having a belief, you're going to be tortured and killed because your belief is different from that of the state. Feels a little harsh. I'm going to stop saying that. The whole thing is harsh. Now, people started fleeing at the mere sight of the Inquisitor, terrified of being cold, questioned, and killed. The Inquisitors had so much power that not even the royals, the nobles, or the famous were exempt. Galileo was tried for heresy for his beliefs about heliocentrism in 1633, the belief that the Earth revolves around the sun. At the time, remember, the Catholic Church was teaching geocentrism, where the Earth was the center of the universe because God made it so, right? So that the Earth and the heavens were the center and everything went around that. And we know, of course, that it's not that, it's heliocentrism. But Galileo, for his scientific beliefs, was persecuted for that and spent a good chunk of his life in prison. So we've got a history here of the Catholic Church targeting so-called heretics, those who don't believe in the Catholic Church's teachings or actively speak out against them. But believe it or not, one of the key events that led to the Spanish Inquisition in particular just happens to be my favorite topic of all time, the Black Death. See? Black Death is everywhere. Black Death is everything. So if you didn't listen to my episode on the Black Death, it was when plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, decimated roughly 1/3 of Europe's population. As a result of massive population loss, there were food shortages, which led to rampant inflation and a rise in poverty. People were miserable. Many didn't want to blame their god for this tragedy, so they turned to a scapegoat: the Jewish populations living around Europe. Now, in my Black Death episode, I mentioned the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Strasbourg, where 2,000 Jews were rounded up and either forcibly converted or burned to death. Half converted, half died. But in another town, Basel? I'm going to go with Basel, Basel. In Switzerland, every Jewish person was arrested and burned alive, simply for being Jewish. We don't persecute people just because of who they are. It's 2024. We don't do that anymore. Now, we call this a pogrom, an organized massacre of a particular ethnic group. And the Jewish pogroms spread from Central and Northern Europe down to Spain, where it combined with the Inquisitions already happening to begin the Spanish Inquisition. Just water today. In 1391, James II of Aragon, not Aragorn, established a law banning anyone who was Jewish from Spain. They were given three choices: leave, convert to Catholicism, or die. It certainly wasn't the first anti-Jewish pogrom in Spain, but it was the beginning of a renewed set of persecutions that led to the Spanish Inquisition. And though the law made it seem like they just wanted the Jews gone, at first, the Catholic Church was really trying to just convert as many Jews as possible. Then, with their new converts, they could bring even more people over from Judaism to the Catholic Church, and those that converted were known as conversos. Converted, right? And though the Catholics did see some success with their conversos, there were also Jewish scholars that doubled down with their faith, pointing out that what the Catholics were doing was not great. And so, in retribution, the Catholic Church decided to punish all Spanish Jews. Starting in 1412, Spain passed a series of anti-Jewish laws to really try to push them out of Spain or get them to convert. Jews were segregated from the city and pushed into slums on the outskirts of town. They were given a strict dress code. They couldn't wear perfume or accessories or luxurious clothing. Men were forced to let their beards grow unruly and long. They were to have no interaction with non-Jews. They were banned from owning land or farms or holding political office or engaging with most businesses or having their own businesses, and were only allowed to perform manual labor, things like splitting wood and carrying water. And as you can imagine, these harsh laws caused mass emigration from Spain into nearby countries like Morocco or Portugal and other European nations to the north. It's estimated that 250,000 Jews left Spain in the 15th century, the 1400s. Now, in addition to all of this, in the 1470s, a Dominican friar ratted out some conversos that were still practicing Judaism in secret. He told the king and queen at the time, Ferdinand and Isabella, about the deception, and it's at this point in time that we see the beginnings of what we now call the Spanish Inquisition. In 1478, Queen Isabella established the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, which began a renewed focus on rooting out heresy in Spain. But why, though? Why Queen Isabella and not her predecessors? Why that moment in time? Well, for one, Isabella was in conflict with her Portuguese counterpart, and more than that, the Portuguese and the French were actively conspiring against Isabella in the hopes of overthrowing her. So, in starting the Spanish Inquisition, Isabella hoped to forge a new alliance with her Portuguese friend over religious unity, right? They're both super Catholic, and perhaps the shared devotion to Catholicism in the Iberian Peninsula will allow Isabella to stay on the throne. She also wanted to remove any potential rival powers in Spain, including anybody who was Jewish. And so, she and her husband established the Spanish Inquisition to take over from the Papal Inquisition in her country, and she put her personal clergyman in charge as the Grand Inquisitor, a man whose name became synonymous with death and mercilessness, the Dominican friar Tomás de Torquemada. And Torquemada was just a whole nother level of cruelty. First, it's worth noting that his family lineage included some conversos, and my guess is that he was really motivated to prove his undying faith and loyalty to Catholicism because he is the reason why the Spanish Inquisition became so violent. His one goal was to remove all heretics from Spain, and by extension, anyone who promoted cultural or religious diversity. The Spanish were to look a certain way and follow a certain set of beliefs, and anything outside of that was seen as heretical. To Torquemada, heretics were the worst kind of people, below even murderers and rapists, because the latter two, at least in Torquemada's eyes, could at least be redeemed. But heretics, they were seen as greedy, hopeless, and unrepentant. So, to root them out, Torquemada established a set of procedures for interrogation, a massive list that all inquisitors would work through, like a whole bunch of questions, in order to establish guilt. And Torquemada's procedures were used for almost the entirety of the Spanish Inquisition, which gives us an idea of how powerful a figure that he was. Among the heretics, Torquemada was especially angered at what he considered to be false conversos, those who converted to Catholicism but really kept practicing Judaism in secret. They were called relapsos. the relapsed, right? And again, perhaps because his own lineage could be traced back to a converso, he was especially sore about the relapsos. But regardless of his motivations, Torquemada and his inquisitors went about Spain tracking them down, looking for signs. For example, following suspected reversos into Jewish stores to see if they only purchased kosher products. Or looking at chimneys on Saturdays to see if suspected reversos were not lighting their fires because they were practicing the Sabbath. Things like that. And if they were caught, it wasn't pretty. Now, in addition to these relapsos, sometimes also called reversos, similar kind of concept, the Spanish inquisitors sought out anyone who doubted the resurrection of Christ, or questions the logic of a pregnant Virgin Mary, or anyone who had no issue with things like premarital sex. They also persecuted those who were accused of any kind of sexual indiscretion that essentially wasn't just a man and a woman married engaging in intimacy to produce children. Anything outside of that was seen as heresy. They also, for a time, hunted down sorcerers and witches, combining those good old European witch hunts with their quest to destroy heresy. One contemporary account wrote, quote, "Everyone shudders at Torquemada's very name, as it has supreme authority over property, life, honor, and even the souls of men." End quote. It got so bad that those who feared prosecution or thought they might be accused turned the tables and ratted out their neighbors. And children were not exempt from this, by the way. Girls as young as 12 and boys as young as 14 were held accountable for their actions and thoughts. No, seriously. And I'm not even going to get on board the misogyny that younger girls were held more accountable than boys, but fine. Not going to go there. Now, as an example, to help prove this point, a 15-year-old girl was brought in by the inquisitors and tortured until she confessed. Not that she was a heretic, but that her mother was. And when the poor girl snapped and confessed to that, the mother was killed. Can you imagine the guilt? And the interrogations themselves, by the way, were rough. After the inquisitors went through Torquemada's list of questions, the accused was given a chance to confess. If the prisoner confessed, they were given a lighter punishment. Sometimes they were let go and put under house arrest. Sometimes they were only lightly beaten and tortured. But those who still wouldn't confess to heresy were automatically accused of lying and brought to a gross, dark, basement prison cell to stay in solitary confinement. They would be left alone for days, sometimes weeks, or in extreme cases for months, to stew on their decision to not confess. And the only person they would see is the inquisitor, and eventually the psychological torture would break them. And after a time, it wasn't just the relapsos or even deviants that were arrested. Protestants were then targeted when Protestantism became a thing, right, in 1517, and then intellectuals in general. Inquisitors engaged in censorship, book banning, book burning. Then it was the Spanish Muslims, who were killed and or chased out of Spain like their Jewish counterparts. And in the 18th century, that's the 1700s, the Freemasons were added to the Catholic Church's list of sworn enemies, so anyone accused of being a Freemason was also put to death. I did a fun, weird episode on a paramasonic group called the Order of the Pug, which is tangentially related to this, so go listen to that episode if you haven't already. That's a weird one. It's weird. Now, after a while, medieval torturers were brought in to help speed up the confession process, and these torturers were paid by the confession, so they got real creative in how they extracted information from their victims. So, let's go over some of the torture methods used during the Spanish Inquisition. Because why not?
Poke her with the soft cushion! Confess! Confess!
One of the more basic, and perhaps mildest methods was flagellation, or flogging. The prisoner would be stripped naked with their wrists bound to a post. The torturer would then use whips or metal rods or wooden planks or a good old cat o' nine tails on their back. And the beatings were so harsh that strips of skin would be pulled away, sometimes sticking to the rods and the instruments. And don't even get me started about hygiene and the spread of disease with these open, bloody wounds. Gross. Another classic one for the Spanish Inquisition was called the strappado. Essentially, the prisoner would be bound by the wrists and then suspended in the air using a rope and pulley. If they were in a cell, they would be raised to the ceiling with at least 6 feet underneath them. If they were outside, they might even be raised higher than that, as high as they could, really as high as the structure allowed. And once suspended, a pair of 100-pound iron weights were shackled to their ankles at a similar height, and then released to drop, pulling the prisoner's legs down, breaking their bones, destroying their nerves and their joints. And never mind the base level of pain from having to hang there from your arms before adding in all of that extra stuff. Super painful. I'm sure you've also heard about the rack. That's a classic one. The torture rack stretched prisoners out by their arms and legs, pulling them into like a Vitruvian Man kind of situation, right? And from here, the torturer would crank a wheel that pulled their limbs back even more, snapping them out of their sockets and causing immense pain. If they wanted to, the torturer could also continue to crank the rack after that, ripping off their arms and legs from the body completely, like complete separation from the trunk. Blah. No, thank you. Sometimes the rack would be used differently. Prisoners would be tied down to it, and a serrated iron ball would be suspended above. Then, like a pendulum, the ball would swing back and forth, slowly lowering each time until it sliced through the prisoner's stomach. Kind of like, there was a Saw movie that had one of those in it. One of the later ones that wasn't as good, but these, I can see where Saw got its ideas from. I'm just putting it out there. It's very Spanish Inquisition. Now, another good one is the iron chair. A chair with rusty spikes on the seat that you would have to sit on. And sometimes there would be a hole in the middle of the chair so they could put a fire underneath it.
The comfy chair. Biggles, put her in the comfy chair.
Yeah, that one hurts. That one would be painful. But I guess if you evenly distribute your weight on the chair, maybe it will be okay. Until they light a fire. Now, in addition to being fixed to these structures, torturers would also employ other methods of torture, sometimes in addition to being strung up or stuck on the chair or on the rack, but sometimes they would do it alone. For example, sorry in advance for those of you who are squeamish about this, sometimes they would use pincers to pull fingernails clean off or even break your fingers off altogether. Sometimes they would be made to wear metal boots that were heated up so the feet burned on the inside and the skin melted into the metal. Heads were dunked in dirty water. I've read that sometimes women would have their breasts torn off with razor-sharp claws or be subjected to the pear of anguish, which was a corkscrew-type instrument inserted into a woman's lady bits. Although modern historians do question whether or not the pear of anguish actually existed, kind of like the Iron Maiden, right? Not the band. A sarcophagus of sorts that has like a face on it, right? It's got spikes on the inside that would close in on a person and impale them. The earliest known Iron Maiden, unfortunately, was built in the 1800s for museums that wanted to display medieval torture devices. And it's become a popular symbol of that ever since, even though it wasn't actually a real medieval torture device. Oops, sorry about that. So why go to these lengths, right? Well, the Inquisitors needed confessions. They were on a mission to root out heresy, and thanks to Pope Innocent IV, they were allowed to employ torture to do so. Sometimes, though, straight humiliation did the trick. In 1486, 750 relapsos were rounded up and forced to walk through the streets of Toledo in Spain, wearing dirty yellow robes with a red cross painted on the front. The shame of walking through the streets and having people yell at them caused many of them to convert back to Catholicism properly, to no longer be relapsed, just a converso. It reminds me of that scene from Game of Thrones where Cersei Lannister is forced to walk through the streets naked with the septa ringing a bell right through King's Landing and yelling shame over and over again. It reminds me a bit of that. It didn't work on Cersei Lannister, but it did work on a lot of the relapsos. Now, after a confession was obtained, many were put to death. Purification of sin by fire. But it got to a point where there were so many that needed to die that they started doing mass executions, and they called it the Act of Faith, or the Auto da Fe. Now, these mass executions were not only ways to cleanse Spain of its suspected heretics, But it also served as kind of a perverse form of entertainment, much in the same way that the Colosseums of Rome had animal bouts or gladiator fights to the death to appease and entertain the people. Now, the auto da fe would be held in city squares or amphitheaters so that lots of people could come and watch. Not only did it help justify the continued inquisitions by providing entertainment, but it also served as a deterrent for any would be heretics who were still out there in the crowd who had gone unsuspected. The largest auto da fe that we know about was held in Madrid in 1680, where hundreds of male and female prisoners were put to death, and over 5,000 spectators watched in attendance. It took a month to put the whole thing together, it boosted the local economy, and there were even food carts out there profiting off of things by selling food and drinks. Like it was like a whole county fair with death and burning. Now, if a prisoner confessed on the spot, they would be given a quicker death by strangulation with a rope or a metal cord, maybe a garrote, I don't know, something like that. But if a prisoner refused to confess, they would be suspended in the air by a rope and lowered into the fire, dying of a burning, horrible, slow, agonizing death as they were cooked from the inside and the crowd cheered them on. Yikes. And this Madrid mass execution was in 1680, which is hundreds of years after the whole Inquisition began, which tells you how much it was a part of everyday life for most people for a really long time. Over time, despite the mass executions, the Inquisition was slowly lessening in intensity and religious vigor. I'd argue that Torquemada, who served as the Grand Inquisitor for about 15 years, oversaw probably the worst period of the Inquisition, but by the 1700s, it was deteriorating. When Charles IV took the throne in 1788, he saw the damage it had done to the public and Spain's economy, so he started to reduce its power, or at least its influence over Spain. But in 1808, things were a little bit more complicated when Napoleon conquered Spain and installed his brother Joseph as the new king. He abolished the Inquisition, just like straight out. It briefly came back with Ferdinand VII once the French no longer controlled the Spanish crown in 1814, but the people weren't having it. It didn't help that a scathing expose came out written by a former general secretary of the Inquisition titled A History of the Inquisition of Spain. The last Inquisition death in Spain was that of a teacher, a man named Cayetano Ripoll, who was accused of being a deist and pushing his beliefs on his students. Essentially, deism is a belief in God, but not in the religious institutions like the Catholic Church. Ripoll was hanged on July 26, 1826. Less than a decade later, it was over for good. Ferdinand VII's widow, Maria Cristina, signed a royal decree ending it. It was already more or less done by this point, but now it was official. The days of the Catholic Church sending inquisitors around the country, trying and executing those suspected and convicting of heresy, were now over. So, how many died in the 356 years of the Spanish Inquisition? Well, actually, despite the meticulous record keeping that went on, the numbers still vary wildly. The general range is somewhere between 30,000 and 300,000, and I know that's a huge range. Some historians even think that millions might have died or been put to death. But according to Professor Agostino Borromeo, a professor of Catholicism in Rome, only 1% of the 125,000 people tried were executed, so only 1,250 people. Dr. Edward Peters of the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, places the number at around 3,000. So while the death toll is still very much debated, it's probably unlikely that it's between the 30,000 to 300,000 range. But again, that's a thing we're still trying to figure out. But the overall lesson that we can take away from the Spanish Inquisition is that when those in power become corrupt, they can abuse their power. And in some cases, like with the Spanish Inquisition, it can go to the extreme. And once it gets to that point, it becomes very hard to end. Those who wanted to speak out against the injustice of it all would just be accused of heresy, and the process continues anew. Or, as British historian Lord Acton once wrote about the Renaissance-era popes, quote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There is no worse heresy than that the office sanctifies on its holder." Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Spanish Inquisition. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't checked out some of my episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things and subscribe to AFOUT on YouTube. You should also go listen to Nedrick, my editor and the genius behind my intro and outro song, Yellow Cake. You can find his stuff wherever you get your music, and there's a link in the description to his website. Now be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.